The frozen asylum. The wind screamed like a banshee across the barren expanse of snow, battering the small convoy of researchers making their way through the Arctic wilderness. The headlights of their snowmobiles cut through the darkness, barely illuminating the endless white void ahead. Among the group was Dr. Elias Cohen, a seasoned historian and investigator of mysterious ruins. Where all the others were nattering nervously, Elias was silent, his brain full of questions about that abandoned construction that he would head toward. Weeks before, a batch of yellowed maps and cryptic jottings had appeared at an auction in Reykjavik, detailing the location of some asylum constructed back during the early 1900s. Official records said nothing about the place. The word St. Dymphna's Sanatorium was scrawled in a shaking hand on one map and appeared next to the phrase, "They will never leave." Intrigued, Elias had convinced a university research team to fund the expedition as being historically important. Now, as they approached the coordinates, a foreboding sense of dread gnawed at him. The asylum loomed ahead like a monolithic shadow, its jagged silhouette barely discernible through the blizzard. The main building was massive, with broken windows that stared out like hollow eyes. Thick icicles hung from the edges of the roof, and the walls were coated in a layer of frost that gleamed under the moonlight. "It's bigger than I thought," Leah Rosen, a young archaeologist layered up in insulated clothing, muttered as she slowed her snowmobile beside Elias's. "This place creeps me out," added Jonah Feldman, the team's cartographer, as he checked his GPS. "Coordinates match exactly, though. We're here." Elias dismounted and approached the entrance of the asylum, a pair of massive iron doors etched with frost-covered carvings. The air chilled the closer he came, as if the building itself was exhaling icy breath. "Help me with this," he said, gesturing to Jonah. Together they pushed against the doors, their combined strength barely enough to crack them open. With a groan of protest, the ancient doors yielded, revealing an entrance hall shrouded in darkness. The flashlights sweep across the interior, revealing walls full of faded wallpaper and furniture frozen in time. The asylum was a paradox of decay and preservation. Wooden floors buckled beneath years of frost, yet eerie remnants of life remained, such as a child's doll sitting in a chair, its painted smile cracked but intact, or a wheelchair lying abandoned in the middle of the hallway, its wheels iced over. Leah shivered. "It's like they just vanished, or something frightened them off," Jonah said darkly. Elias didn't pay them much mind. He was fascinated by a huge ledger lying open on a reception desk. He brushed off the frost and read the scrawled handwriting. Admissions, January 1908. Patient count, 216. Below that, in red ink, March 1910. Patient count, 0. Facility closed. "What did to them?" Elias whispered. A crash broke through the stillness deeper in the building. The team's breaths froze in their mouths as they halted, the cold air beaded on their lips. "What in the world was that?" Leah whispered. Jonah held his flashlight up toward the stairs leading up to the floors. His light flickered wildly, then steadied. "It's probably just ice falling," Elias said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let's stick together and check it out. We need to document everything." The group ascended the staircase, their boots crunching on frost-coated steps. The second floor was even colder than the first, as if the chill intensified with each level. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with doors that bore patient numbers and rusted locks. Elias tried the nearest door. It creaked open to reveal a small room containing a metal-framed bed, a nightstand, and a journal frozen to the surface of the desk. He pried it loose, carefully opening its brittle pages. The entries were incoherent ramblings. "The walls are alive. They whisper when the lights go out. I see her face in the window, always smiling. It isn't real. It isn't real." Elias felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He closed the journal and placed it in his bag for later study. A sudden, bone-chilling scream shattered the silence, echoing from the far end of the hallway. "Tell me that was the wind," Leah said, her voice trembling. Elias tightened his grip on his flashlight. "We're not alone." They followed the sound to a large ward at the end of the corridor. The double doors swung open easily, revealing rows of empty beds arranged in perfect symmetry. The room was unnaturally cold. Their breath fogged instantly, and frost crept along the walls like veins. A shadow moved at the far end of the ward. Tall and human, but its movements jerky and unnatural, like it's struggling against invisible restraints. The team froze in place, their flashlights fixed on the figure. "Hello?" Elias called, his voice echoing off the cavernous space. The shadow paused and swiveled around toward them. It stood still for a moment before it started gliding across the room, swiftly, silently. "Run!" Jonah shouted, breaking the spell of terror. The group ran out of the ward, their boots slipping on the icy floor. The shadow followed, moving faster than should have been possible. Elias could feel the cold seeping into his bones as he ran, his heart pounding in his chest. They burst through a set of ornate wooden doors and emerged into a chapel. The room was unsettlingly untouched by time. There were candles still standing upon the altar, their wicks dark but unbroken. Stained glass windows showed saints with sad faces, their bright colors dulled in the frost. Jonah slammed shut the doors and leaned against them to pant. "What the fuck was that?" "No idea," Elias said, trying to catch his breath. "But it wasn't human." Leah pointed to the altar. "Look." A huge leather-bound book lay open on the altar, its pages crammed full of ancient Latin script. The pictures showed crude figures and rituals, and Leah was forced to look away. Elias edged forward cautiously, tracing the embossed cover with his fingers. The title was worn, but one word was distinct. "Sacramentum." "What is this place?" he whispered. No one answered. The candles flickered into flame, and the shadows on the walls seemed to dance with a macabre energy. The low growl from the darkness intensified, and the temperature plummeted even more. "We need to leave," Leah said, her voice shaking. "Not yet," Elias replied, clutching the book tightly. "This is why we came." The growl grew louder, and the shadows took on shape in the walls. Dark, featureless personas, empty faces, and open mouths. The flickering candlelight in the chapel cast eerie shadows across the frost-coated walls. Elias held the ancient book close, its weight pressing against him like an anchor in a sea of dread. Leah and Jonah stood close to him, their faces pale and their breath visible in the freezing air. The guttural growl that had filled the room moments ago was gone, but the oppressive silence that replaced it felt even more sinister. "Do you hear that?" Leah whispered. Elias strained his ears. At first, there was nothing but the sound of their own breathing. Then it came, a faint whisper, like wind moving through a cracked window. But the whispers carried words. Unintelligible at first, they grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic symphony of voices. Jonah backed toward the door. "This place isn't abandoned, not completely." Elias flipped through the pages in his hands. Symbols and sketches of ritual practices filled the pages, but words seemed to slide out of place, as if the page itself was alive. He ran his fingers over one passage, and for an instant, the whispers stopped. "We can't leave," Elias said firmly, turning to the others. "Not until we understand what happened here." "Understand?" Leah's voice rose in panic. "Elias, people died here. Something evil happened, and it's still here." "Exactly," he replied. "And that's why we need to stay." Reluctantly, they left the chapel and ventured back into the asylum's dark corridors. The cold seemed more intense now, biting through their clothing and numbing their fingers. Elias led the way, flashlight in one hand and the ancient book in the other. The whispers followed them, increasing in volume as they moved further into the building. Sometimes the voices seemed to be saying their names, a haunting echo that made Leah jump and Jonah curse under his breath. They stopped in front of a room labeled Archives. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered inside. "Someone's here," Jonah muttered, pulling a flare gun from his belt. Elias pushed the door open cautiously. The room was filled with rows of filing cabinets, their drawers hanging open and papers scattered across the floor. A single lantern flickered on a desk in the center of the room, casting long shadows on the walls. "Who lit this?" Leah asked, her voice barely audible. Elias approached the desk, scanning the papers laid out before him. Many of them were medical records, listing patient admissions and treatments. But one stood out, a worn handwritten note pinned under a rusted scalpel. "They're watching. The walls remember. Don't trust the light." Elias pocketed the note and turned towards the others. This wasn't just an asylum. Something else was going on here, something the staff tried to keep covered up. As if in answer, the flame of the lantern went out and the room plunged into blackness. Panic erupted as the team's flashlights flickered and died, leaving them blind in the icy void. "Stay close!" Elias shouted, reaching out blindly. His hand brushed against Leah's jacket, and he held on tightly. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy, they echoed through the room, louder by the second. "Who's there?" demanded Jonah, his voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but quiet. Then, from the darkness, a deep, raspy voice spoke. "Why have you come?" Before anyone could respond, the room erupted into chaos. Cabinets slammed shut, papers flew through the air, and the whispers returned, deafening and relentless. Elias pulled Leah and Jonah toward the door, shouting over the cacophony. "Run!" They staggered into the hallway, following a wash of whispers like a sound tidal wave. The air grew even colder, and the walls shut in on them. Doors flapped open and shut as though controlled by some unseen force, and every step on the icy floor was akin to walking blind in a snowstorm. Behind them, the heavy footsteps came back again, gaining momentum. Jonah blindly fired the flare gun over his shoulder. The red burst of light illuminated the corridor for a split second before dying, and it showed a figure towering behind them. It was indistinct, like smoke moving across the floor, but the eyes were clear, burning with malevolent glow. "This way!" Elias yelled, taking off for a staircase they hadn't checked yet. The stairs spiraled down into the asylum's bowels, growing thick and heavy with stifling air, despite how freezing it was outside. It led them out to a cavernous basement that was covered in rusted pipes and broken machinery. The whispers died away into oppressive silence. "Where are we?" Leah asked, her voice quivering. Jonah swept the flashlight around the room. There was a tunnel grid that split off in every direction, given its seemingly endless reach. Ahead of him stood one of the biggest steel doors he'd ever seen. Its surface was lined with strange-looking symbols. Elias reached out to touch the door. His breath filled the air. "Looks like a vault." "What would an asylum need with a vault?" Leah asked. Elias ran his fingers over the markings. "I don't think this was just an asylum. It's almost as if they were containing something." A low hum came from the door, and the markings glowed faintly. The air was colder, and the walls vibrated with unseen energy. "We shouldn't be here," Jonah said, taking a step back. Elias ignored him, placing the ancient book on the ground and turning to a page filled with similar symbols. As he read aloud, the hum grew louder, and the steel door creaked as if something behind it stirred. Leah grabbed Elias's arm. "Stop! You don't know what you're doing!" There was a deafening roar, and the door burst open. A cold rush of air hit them, carrying them to the floor, and out of the dark beyond the door emerged a form muffled in frost and shadow. It was humanoid in shape, but impossibly tall. Its limbs reached out around it, jagged shards of ice. Its face was smooth and barren except for two piercing blue eyes that glowed with unnatural light. The whispers grew louder as the creature entered the room, its presence suffocating, a weight and crushing force that pressed down on them. End. Elias scrambled to his feet, clutching the book. "What are you?" he demanded. The creature tilted its head, as if amused. When it spoke, its voice was a chilling blend of multiple tones. "I am the forgotten, the condemned, and now I am free." The cold of the asylum had become a living thing, pressing against the group as they stumbled away from the basement vault. Elias clutched the ancient book tightly to his chest, its worn leather cover now damp with frost. Leah and Jonah followed closely behind, their breaths shallow and visible in the icy air. The thing that had emerged from the vault had not pursued them, yet. Leah broke the silence, her voice shaking. "We must go, now." "We can't," Elias said, his tone harder than he'd meant to make it. He rounded on them, his features half fear, half resolution. "Whatever that thing is, it's connected to this place. If we leave, it might take us with it." Jonah glared at him. "You opened the door. This is on you." The two men looked at each other, their breath misting in the cold corridor. Leah interposed herself between them, holding up her hands. "Stop it. Fighting isn't going to help us." She glanced down the hall, her eyes flicking to every shadow. "Let's just find somewhere safe and figure out what to do next." Elias nodded reluctantly. "Okay, but we need to know what we are up against." He pointed to the book. "The answers are in there." They walked to the infirmary of the asylum, where the entrance was marked by a faded sign almost invisible under the frost. The room inside was starkly clean compared to the rest of the asylum. Metal beds lined the walls, their sheets crisp and untouched, as if waiting for patience. Jonah shivered. It's like they just disappeared. Leah stepped over to one of the beds and ran her fingers over the sheet. No dust, no rot. It's as if time has stopped here. Elias put the book down on a nearby table and began to flip through its pages. The symbols and the text shimmered in the dim light, as if the book itself came alive. "What are you looking for?" Leah asked. "Clues," Elias said. He halted on a page full of elaborate drawings of the asylum's design, overlaid with weird symbols. "Check this out." Leah and Jonah leaned over the book. The drawings outlined a network of tunnels below the asylum. The vault centered between them. Smaller rooms surrounded it, each with cryptic notes. These rooms... Elias traced a finger over the drawings. They were for rituals. This asylum wasn't just for patients. They were experimenting with something dangerous. Leah's face paled. What kind of experiments? Elias hesitated, his eyes scanning the notes. Summoning, binding, containing, something ancient. As Elias deciphered the book, the infirmary grew colder. Frost crept across the walls, forming intricate patterns that resembled faces, distorted, screaming faces. Leah gasped, pointing to the nearest wall. "Do you see that?" The others turned to look. The faces in the frost seemed to move, their mouths opening and closing in silent agony. Then the whispers began, low and guttural, rising in volume until they filled the room. "Get out!" a voice growled, deep and menacing. Jonah grabbed Elias by the arm. "We need to leave, now!" Just before anyone could get a move on, the infirmary door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The lights flickered, and the frost began spreading rapidly across the walls, encasing the beds and furniture in icy tombs. Elias opened the book again, frantically scanning it for something, anything that could help. His fingers came to rest on a passage written in jagged script. "The frost remembers. The frost binds." What does that mean? Leah asked, her voice shaking. Elias didn't have time to respond. Frost on the walls began peeling away, revealing something darker beneath, shadows that moved and writhed as if alive. From the shadows emerged a figure, humanoid, but grotesquely twisted. Its limbs were elongated, its fingers ending in razor-sharp claws. Its face was a blank slate, save for 2 hollow sockets where its eyes should have been. The whispers grew louder as the figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Jonah raised the flare gun, aiming it at the creature. "Stay back!" The figure stopped, tilting its head as if studying them. Then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, it spoke. "You cannot escape. You belong to the frost." Jonah lit the flare. The flash temporarily blinded them, and the beast howled, then scurried into the dark. "Run!" Elias yelled, grabbing the book and dashing toward the doorway. The 3 of them shot into the hallway, the whispers shrieking behind them, like a storm gathering strength. The frost crept along the walls and pursued them as they fled. They ran into the storage room and barricaded the door with whatever they had at hand. Elias slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. Leah turned to him, terrified. "What do we do now? That thing is going to kill us." Elias raised the book. "The rituals. If they use those to bind the creature, perhaps we can use them to trap it again." Jonah shook his head. "You're mad. That thing isn't just a spirit, it is evil incarnate." "It doesn't matter," Elias snapped back. "If we don't stop it, we're dead." Leah nodded in reluctance. "What do we need?" Elias began flipping through the book as his hands were shaking. "We need to find one of the chambers from the sketches. The symbols there will amplify the ritual." He led the way, following the map into one of the chambers marked in the book. It was perilous, with the frost spreading fast, the whispers rising louder. The air had gotten so cold that their breaths froze in mid-air and dropped to the ground like small fragments of ice. When they finally reached the chamber, it was exactly as depicted in the book. A circular room with strange symbols carved into the floor and walls. At the center was a pedestal, its surface covered in frost. Elias set the book on the pedestal and began arranging the objects required for the ritual: candles, a vial of liquid he had found in the infirmary, and a piece of shattered glass. The whispers grew deafening. The walls began to close in with jagged frost forming like knives. The shadowy figure had appeared at the entrance, and the hollow eyes were fixed upon them. "Hurry!" Leah screamed. Elias lit the candles and started chanting in the book. The symbols on the walls began to gleam, their light pushing back the frost. The creature let out a shriek and lunged forward, but an invisible barrier blocked it. The frost retreated, and whispers dissipated as the ritual came to a head. By one final word, Elias slammed the cover shut on the book, where the creature dissolved into a puff of shadows and vanished into ethereal nothingness. The silence that followed the creature's dissolution was deafening. Elias, Leah, and Jonah stood motionless in the circular chamber, their breath visible in the cold air. The glowing symbols on the walls began to fade, leaving the room in near darkness. The oppressive cold that had clung to them seemed to lift slightly, but the air still carried an eerie stillness. Leah broke the silence. "Is it over?" Elias shook his head, holding the ancient book very tightly. "I don't think that's it. That wasn't the end. Only a momentary reprieve." Jonah slumped against the wall and looked pale. "You're saying we risked our lives for nothing? We could have died back there." "We still might," Elias replied grimly. He opened the book again, eyes scanning over the cryptic text. This creature, this warden, was but one part of the asylum's secret. There is something greater, something darker at play. Leah frowned. "What are you saying? We watched it disappear. Isn't that what the ritual was for?" Elias hesitated before answering. "The book says, 'The Waking Frost.' It is not a creature. It is a power, a curse connected to this asylum. The warden was only its minion. The three stepped out of the ritual chamber cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the frozen corridors. The asylum seemed even more desolate now, the frost retreating but leaving behind an unnatural chill. The lights flickered on and off, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Leah clutched her arms, shivering. "I don't like this. It feels like the asylum is alive." Jonah scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's just an old building. We're letting our imaginations get the better of us." As they passed an open doorway, Elias froze. Inside was what appeared to be an office, the furniture eerily untouched by time. Papers were strewn across the desk, and a large blackboard stood against the wall, covered in faded chalk writings. "This might give us some answers," Elias said, stepping inside. Leah and Jonah followed reluctantly. The air in the room felt different, heavier, charged with an unseen energy. Elias started to rifle through the papers, his brow furrowed. Most were medical reports, detailing patients' conditions and treatments. But one file caught his attention. "Look at this," he said, holding up a document. The header read, "Project Permafrost." The file contained fragments of reports, photographs, and handwritten notes. It detailed a secret experiment conducted within the asylum, overseen by a shadowy organization. The goal was to harness an ancient power said to reside beneath the asylum, a power tied to the frost that now plagued them. Leah read over his shoulder, her eyes widening. They were trying to weaponize it. Why would anyone do that? "Power," Elias replied bitterly. "They didn't care about the consequences." Jonah pointed to a photograph included in the file. It showed a group of men in lab coats standing in front of a massive metal door, the same door they had found in the basement vault. "This is insane," Jonah muttered. "They unleashed something they couldn't control, and now we're paying the price." Elias nodded grimly. "And if we don't stop it, it'll spread beyond the asylum." The file mentioned a central chamber deep within the asylum, referred to as the heart. It was described as the source of the frost and the key to containing it. "We need to find this chamber," Elias said, his voice resolute. Jonah groaned. "Another chamber? The last one nearly got us killed." Leah touched Jonah's arm. "Do you have a better idea? We can't just leave and pretend this never happened." Resigned, Jonah nodded, and the three of them headed out to find the room. The map from the book, combined with, the details in the file, led them through the confusing passages of the asylum. As they ventured deeper, the temperature plummeted once more. The frost returned, creeping along the walls and floor like a living entity. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. "This feels wrong," Leah said, glancing over her shoulder. "Like we're being watched." Elias didn't react, his eyes on the book. The symbols within the text seemed to glow softly, as if reacting to their nearness to the heart. Suddenly, Jonah froze. "Did you hear that?" They all became silent. There was a low, guttural growl, accompanied by the scraping sound on metal coming from in front. "Whatever it is, it's blocking our way." Elias tightened his grip on the book. They turned a corner and found another creature, bigger and nastier than the warden. It was covered in jagged ice, and its eyes were glowing with an unnatural blue light. It let out a deafening roar, the sound of which echoed through the corridors. "Run!" Elias shouted. They ran down the hallway, the creature following them. Its claws scraped against the walls, sending shards of ice flying in all directions. Leah stumbled, but Jonah grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "Keep moving." They dashed into a side passage and shut the door behind them. The creature pounded against it, but the thick metal held. Elias flipped through the book frantically. "There's a binding spell here. If I can cast it, we might be able to trap it." "Hurry up!" Jonah yelled, bracing the door with his shoulder. Elias began chanting, his words odd and guttural. Symbols on the cover of the book flared into greater brilliance, frost melting back off the door. In a last word, energy blasted out from the book, and the hammering stopped. They pushed the door open. It was empty, but on the floor lay a pool of melted ice. Finally, they arrived in the central chamber. This chamber was vast and circular, as the ritual chamber was but so much more elaborate. It was covered in intricacies of carvings that were placed on the walls, scenes where people bowed before a gigantic ice figure. In the middle sat a pedestal, with resting there a glowing crystal surrounded with frost. "This is it," Elias said, approaching the pedestal. Leah hesitated. "Are you sure? What if touching it makes things worse?" Elias shook his head. "We don't have a choice. This crystal is the source of the frost. If we destroy it, we might be able to stop this." Before anyone could respond, the whispers grew deafening, and the frost surged forward, encasing walls and floor. The carvings seemed to come alive, their figures moving and writhing in the icy light. The crystalline glow of the heart bathed the room with a ghostly light as flickering shadows danced on carvings. Leah, Jonah, and Elias stood spellbound, their breath steaming in the icy air. Except for the faint hum coming from within the crystal, the oppressive silence of the chamber was its only sound. "This is it," Elias whispered almost inaudibly, his voice racking with a shiver of fear. "This is the cause of it all. The frost, the whispers, the creatures." Jonah hesitated, taking a cautious step forward, his eyes fixed on the crystal. "So what do we do? Smash it?" "Not so simple," Elias said, holding up the ancient book. "Destroying it may well let its power loose completely. We have to bind it, keep it contained." Leah furrowed her brow. "How? That thing looks alive. Do we even know what we're dealing with?" "No," Elias admitted, flipping through the book's pages. "But this book does. There's a ritual here, a final one. If we perform it correctly, it should sever the frost's connection to the asylum." As Elias read the text, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. They weren't just voices, they bore emotions: rage, sorrow, despair. The carvings on the walls appeared to twist in the flickering light as their frozen figures strained against invisible bonds. Leah shuddered. "I don't like this. It feels like the asylum doesn't want us here." Jonah cast a nervous glance at the walls. "Or whatever's inside that thing doesn't want us to stop it." Elias set the book on the pedestal next to the crystal, positioning the objects they'd gathered on their journey: the shard of frost, the warden's amulet, and a vial of water from the asylum's frozen well. "These are the components," Elias explained. "They represent the elements attached to the frost. Coupled with the incantation, they should weaken the crystal's hold." Elias began his chanting, his voice steady and even as the tension in the room grew. The ancient words echoed off the walls, taking on the whispers until becoming a cacophony. The crystal pulsed with light, and the frost on the floor began to crack, spreading fissures like veins. The air grew colder, biting into their skin despite their heavy clothing. Leah and Jonah stood guard, their eyes darting to every shadow. The asylum seemed to be reacting to the ritual, groaning and creaking as if in protest. "Keep going," Leah urged as the light from the crystal grew blinding. Just as the ritual reached its climax, a deafening roar burst forth from the corridor behind them. The icebound guardian had returned, its jagged form charging into the chamber. Jonah cursed under his breath. "It's not over yet." Leah grabbed a metal rod off the floor and waved it around like a weapon. "We'll hold it off. You finish the ritual." Elias did not look up, his concentration unwavering. The symbols on the book began to shine brighter as he chanted, the words louder and more forceful. The Guardian lunged, its claws swiping at Leah. She dodged barely in time, striking its icy limb with the rod. Jonah joined her, wielding a broken chair leg as a makeshift club. The creature roared again, its icy breath freezing the ground beneath their feet. Elias got to the final word of the incantation. The things on the pedestal start shining at the moment he spoke that word, and their shine all united on the crystal. Whispers reached a feverish level, then stopped as the room blazed white. When the light was gone, the crystal cracked but did not break apart. Frost receded little bit, and oppressive cold disappeared. Leah and Jonah slumped against the wall, panting. The Guardian was gone, its icy remains melted into floor. "Did it work?" Leah asked, her voice full of quiver. Elias examined the crystal, his countenance grim. "Not entirely. The frost is weaker but not gone. There's something left to do." As Elias read the last page of the book, a more chilling truth was revealed. Complete severance of the frost's power required a life voluntarily given. Elias's heart sank as he read the words. "It needs a sacrifice," he said quietly. Leah's eyes widened. "What? You mean one of us?" "There's no other way," Elias said, his voice heavy with resignation. "The frost's hold is too strong. It needs to be balanced by a life freely offered." Jonah shook his head. "Number, we've come too far to lose anyone now. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Elias said firmly. He stepped forward toward the pedestal, his gaze unwavering. "This started because of the greed and hubris of men like me. It's only fitting that I be the one to end it." Leah grabbed his arm. "No, there has to be another way. We'll find it together." Elias gently pulled free, a sad smile on his face. "You'll finish this journey without me. Protect each other. Tell the world what happened here." Elias placed his hands on the crystal, the glowing cracks spreading to his fingers. The frost surged toward him, encasing his body in ice. His lips moved in a final prayer, his voice barely audible. The crystal shattered, sending out a shockwave that ruffled the asylum. Frost instantly melted into dust as carvings fell. Stifling coldness was banished by a warm, soothing breeze. Leah and Jonah shielded their eyes as light fell darker. When they looked again, Elias was gone. On the pedestal, only the shards of the crystal glowed faintly. As they walked up to the surface, there was a silent peace in the asylum. Frost had all but disappeared, and the air was fresh and clean. The white landscape outside seemed less dangerous. The sun broke through the clouds. Leah looked back at the asylum, tears falling down her face. "He gave everything to save us, to save the world." Jonah placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. People need to know what happened here." As they walked away, the asylum stood silent and empty, its dark secrets buried beneath the melting ice.